Hello, everyone. My name is Brett, and welcome to another edition of the Waking from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. Here again for his monthly Q&A is John Vervaeke. Thank you, John, for being here today.
Glad to be here, and I haven't had a chance to look at, but I saw you had Eric here. That's great.
Yeah, we had a great discussion last week. It was fantastic. He's a really interesting guy, and I think a lot of the work that he's doing seems very convergent with the stuff that we're doing over here. So I'm hoping that we have a lot more
Yeah,
interactions with him.
good, good. I think that's a good idea. I think that's a very good idea.
So to start off, just exciting news: you've just recorded your podcast with Dr. Jordan Peterson, and so that's very
Yeah,
exciting.
yeah. He invited, as some of you may know from Twitter, he invited me onto his podcast, and so we recorded on Friday. Everybody was happy with it. I think it'll. They said it'll probably be out around 3 weeks. So, looking forward to that. And I'll be releasing it on my channel, and he'll be releasing it on his.
That's fantastic. Well, I can't wait for that. So we'll get started with question one.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was gonna say it went really well. I was very pleased. Yeah, for sure.
That's amazing. So I have a question first off. And we were discussing this a couple weeks ago in meditation. So when you're just following your breath in meditation, should we be should we be controlling our breath at all, like making it deeper, slower, focusing on the dantian, or just letting it happen and observing it as we can?
So, I mean, in the tradition I was taught, I recommend focusing on the dantian because that tends to have a grounding effect and a stabilizing effect. You do the same thing in martial arts. But other than that, you should leave your breathing as natural as possible. So there'll be times when your breathing is very shallow, for example, in some deep meditative states, and don't worry about that. So unless you are doing a specific breathing exercise, pranayama, the general advice is to leave your breathing as natural as possible. And for a couple of the practices, like some of the prajna practices, it's very important to make sure you're not hyperventilating, because people tend to unconsciously control their breath and hyperventilate in order to extend the amount of time they're doing in the breathing practices.
All right. Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, and that question actually arose in my mind when I noticed that when I left my breath alone, it was much shallower, and I wondered
Yep.
if that was okay, but I guess that is okay. Uh,
Yeah, it is okay. So it as long as you're not falling asleep, you can let your breathing go quite shallow.
all right, that's great. All right, Struan, you have a question. I've just sent you an invite, and there's not a lot queued up now, so you could have a bit of an extended discussion with John tonight if you'd like.
Oh, and this is one of the few times which I haven't had a chance to read Strawn's emails. He sent me about four or five, and Strawn, I have to apologize. I'm way behind. I've been recording a lot of long form discussions recently. So
Oh, and I think Strawn is having some difficulty with his sound right now. Uh, we can't hear you, Struan. So maybe we'll give him a second to go in. And I should just note that so for the summer, John's schedule is very busy, and what we're going to be doing is so we've been doing an hour and a half of these Q&As, but starting tonight we're only going to have an hour, and through the summer just an hour. But we're very grateful for all the time that you give us, John. So thank you for that.
my pleasure. Looks like Strawn's having some technological difficulties.
Let me see. I don't. Yeah, he's not muted. So hopefully, Struan, maybe reboot and so Mark's asking, do we have to unmute after they hit the stage? No, usually people are unmuted automatically when they come in. Oh, Strawn's reconnected, so I'm going to bring him back in. So sorry for the technical glitches. So Strawn, I've sent you a invitation. Let's see if it's fixed.
Hello.
Yes, we hear you, Strawn. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Sorry about that. Hi, John.
Hi, Struan. Did you hear my preemptive apology or not?
Yeah, that's no worries. I actually reconsidered my question at the last second anyway. So, but what I wanted to
Okay.
ask was, oh, well, actually, what I wanted to first say is that this month has been absolutely amazing with the conversations that you've had between with Zehi Levin and then Slavin, sorry, and then Brett Anderson and then Bernardo Kastrup. I mean, those conversations
Yeah.
are just phenomenal. So I wanted
Thank
to
you.
just bring attention to that. And yeah, and then and then there's still the Jordan Peterson conversation which happened yesterday, which we haven't seen yet. So May's really been fantastic. And yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the question was Duns Scotus's principle of the univocity of being. Would you consider that hostile to the principle of a non-logical identity?
Yeah, I think so. Because typically I mean, we have to be careful because, we're in danger of being anachronistic with him. But I think Tyson, on his book Returning to Reality, Christian Platonism for Today, makes a very good case about sort of how profound Scotus's nominalism is, and it's not quite Occam, but it's close. It's really heading definitely in that direction. And so one of the things typically that most nominalists reject as having any real existence are any kind of narrative relations in the world. And I mean, when they try to mitigate this, they talk about sort of brute resemblances. But I think when you look at Bremer's criticism of nominalism on Platonism and the object of science, that's ultimately a contradictory position. So I think Scotus would have to say that narrative relations exist only in the mind. How they exist in the mind, of course, is one of the perennial problems of nominalism. Why can they exist in the mind but not in the world?
Yeah.
But I'll put that aside. So I think that I think the tie. What I'm trying to say, I'm doing it in a clumsy fashion. Let me be more careful. I think there's deep ties between his call to a univocity of being, nominalism, and then the removal of all patterns from the world. I think that's a pretty straight line.
Yeah, and so then you get well, then your attempt to reintroduce real relations into the ontology then is like a counter move against, well, Occam, but also then Scotus, right?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, the one thing that I wanted to ask in connection with that was Proclus's metaphysics had his first principle was meant to be simple. And I was just wondering if you think that a simple first principle is also, like, if it has the same kind of problems with respect to the univocity of being, that it creates tensions, that it doesn't allow. Well, at least from my thinking, the univocity of being would be opposed to, let's say, an analogical way of looking at things, and then the analogical way of looking at things is like a more relative way of looking at things. But then the relative is like a relational way. But the fact that it's the idea of a first principle being simple, it seems to me that it excludes the possibility of relational things, that it makes everything absolute. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
No, that's good. That's good. And in my second conversation with Bernardo, this came up because I'm deeply influenced by John Scotus Erigena, not to be in any way confused with Duns Scotus, right? John Scotus Erigena and Bernard Katz's The Metaphysics of Meaning. Because what I think you're doing is pointing to one of the central problems, or I would even go so far as almost to say mysteries, within an emanation metaphysics. Because
Right.
When you look at Proclus, he seems to be committed to, as you say, the absolute simplicity, but also he needs all of the machinery of procession and return, which requires, and he explicitly argues, I'm going through the elements of theology right now, requires different levels of being and different gradations of realness. And then what I argued is I think that problem is equivalent to the problem of how a bottom up there's an equivalent problem for a bottom up emergentist, which is how do they ever get to a unified normativity in any kind of fashion. And so Katz argued way back when in the Metaphysics of Meaning, I think it was in the 80s, it was a really brilliant book, that those problems seem to be symmetrically difficult, that they have sort of they have symmetrical strengths and weaknesses. So where one is where one is strong, the other is weak, and vice versa. And so that's why I've become deeply interested in Erigena's attempt to wrestle with that symmetry and propose a dialectical metaphysics to try and give equal weighting, if that's the right way to put it, with the emanation and the emergence principles. But I do think the point you just made, I think it's a direct entailment, in fact, of this central difficulty found within emanationist metaphysics. Not just Neoplatonism, but I think all emanationist metaphysics suffer from this problem.
Yeah, I would agree. There's one just side thought that I had in conjunction that maybe you can help me with this. Is it that Plotinus? You said that his chain of being was flawed because it had evil, or it stipulated that matter was evil.
Yeah.
But the thing that occurred to me is that, well, I also don't. I try not to have a hierarchy between moreness and suchness, right? That would I would take that to be emergence and emanation in this conversation. But what Plotinus's ontology allows, as far as I can see, is it makes his aspiration project explicit within the metaphysics, because there is the hierarchy. And if you lose that, then it becomes... Sorry?
I think you're right. I agree with that. I think you pay a heavy cost for it. I just want to make sure my point's clear, and then I'll let you respond.
Yeah.
Because my concern is, like, so you make the aspirational project central, but let's remember what matter is for Plotinus. It's potential. It's pure potential. And notice the tension between those two claims. Trying to valorize aspiration, which has to take possibility as something valuable and real, and then a metaphysics that says, no, possibility is ultimately evil and privative. That's a tension, I think.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that completely.
Okay.
All I'm just saying is that what I'm asking is, you do see how it becomes difficult to actually use the metaphysics to make the aspiration explicit without the hierarchy. Like.
Yeah.
Okay.
I see that point. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So, sorry, that was just a lot of questions, but I know that you intend to make all of this explicit, but I was just trying to get like a better idea of exactly where you sit and where you're likely to go.
Right now I'm. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Stron.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say I'm very interested in this because it sounds to me like you're taking quite a strong position on the problem of universals, because of this book that's arguing for Christian Platonism, or not Christian Platonism, but Platonism in science.
The Berman book on Platonism and the objects of science. I think so. I mean, the core of the argument is, what do we have to presuppose in our ontology in order to explain the existence of science? He basically argues that nominalism, Aristotelianism, and constructionism, and he does it very sharply. He's very tight argument, are insufficient for the job. So that's why he opts for a kind of Platonism. I should let you know that I've been talking with Matt Segal, and I'm reading his book, and I'm going back again. I'm looking at Whitehead and Whitehead's attempt to try and reconcile these two things, and reconcile that with science. And so some really interesting work coming out around that right now. So
if I could just make a crazy suggestion to you, the thing that occurred to me, because the word that Proclus used for when he speaks about the one, he uses the word the Greek to hen for the whole.
Yep.
And then, but
Yep.
then he speaks about beings beyond being, but he makes a distinction between the whole is general and then the beings are particular. And it occurs
Yeah.
to me
Yeah.
that if you make,
As the he
but because
nods.
he
Yeah.
uses, yeah, because he uses the word ousia for that's Aristotle's word for substance, but the substance, well, I suppose, I don't think Aristotle meant ousia as a hypostasis. Um, but the point is that, sorry, if you treat matter as the particulars, like Occam had it as the raw individuals, and then space as the general form, then I think that is a good way to get the substance and the form duality, or the particular and the general duality, actually working together, so that it makes the emanation and the emergence actually speak together nicely. But I don't know.
Mm.
That would just be something you'd have to think over.
Yeah, I'd have to think over that because I mean, um, because Berman is arguing very, very strongly that the kind of real relations that are needed to support the inferences that are at the core of science are ultimately non-spatio-temporal, in order to be able to deal with counterfactuality, falsity, and a bunch of other things that you need in order to do science. So, I mean, I'm not finished that book, and I have to think about what you just said. I'm sorry, that's not a very good answer, but that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, I wouldn't expect you to have a very comprehensive answer to that at the drop of a hat. It's quite a difficult or intricate suggestion, I would say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but that's
Any
cool.
other questions?
It's very cool.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll probably got more questions, but I think yeah, Velasquez's got one next. So thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Drew and Vlaskin. I've sent you an invite so you can come in. Great.
Hello? Okay, yeah, it's working. So, in fact, you just sort of alluded to the thing I wanted to ask about just now, John. You talked about
Oh, great.
a dialectical metaphysics or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I've just been thinking over this thing. I can't remember if you've made it very like super explicit, but you've made this analog between how philosophy is generally spoken about the logos, but now you seem to be getting at something like dialogos instead. And I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah.
wondering, do you kind of see, like, what do you think about the idea of like there being the dialogos as like a principle that is, well, yeah, it's like our highest principle, but it's dialectical.
Yeah, that's very good. I haven't been explicit on that because you're bang on, and where the forest that my thinking is wandering in. But I haven't been explicit because I'm trying to get clear about what the relationship is in Erigena between logos and dialectic and dialogos. So yeah, it's an open question for me. If we move to the kind of symmetry metaphysics, which, by the way, right, would help to explain why we get all these symmetries in the scientific model between matter and energy, time and space, wave and particle, right? So if we move to that, and this is why I'm looking at Whitehead, do we then see the logos as situated within something like you said, like a dialectic, that a dialogos, and perhaps, and that's a big perhaps. So notice how tentative I am right now. Is that what Christian Platonism was trying to do in order to integrate logos and agape together? Because then the procession and return of the logos is understood in terms of agape and reciprocal opening. I Yeah, you can. I hope you can hear that this is something that I'm really trying to get clear on with the help of Erigena, who I'm reading through the Division of Nature as part of my daily practice. That's his main work. Like I said, I'm reading Matzagal and getting back into Whitehead, and also looking again at Spinoza as people who tried to give us some language around this. I think best I can answer you is I think that proposal is one of taking seriously, but obviously for the exact same reasons, it shouldn't be made lightly. And I think what I'm moving towards is the idea that experience of dialogos, when we're doing dialectic is the practice, dialogos is the process that takes on a life of its own. And when we are experiencing dialogos, we are tapping into something fundamental about sort of the grammar of being, and that it's giving us access. So the logos is in the process of dialogos, but the process of dialogos is itself participates in a way in which being fundamentally discloses itself in intelligibility. I'm sorry, that's very tentative and convoluted, but that's again, you folks are asking me sort of questions right at which I welcome at the cutting edge of my thinking and reflecting right now. But that's what I'm considering, and that's who I'm consulting.
Yeah, I think your tentativeness is probably wise, because I think it's the way to go. I'm thinking about it, but I can see some pitfalls if we don't make the case carefully or whatever. So
Yeah,
like
I mean,
it could be overly vague or something like that.
it could be overly vague, or it could be not distinct enough that people would just assimilate it mindlessly to a kind of Hegelianism or things like that. I mean, and there's a real danger around that, because John Scotus Erigena got the label of being the Hegel of the ninth century. Now, I imagine that's intended to be a compliment, and I think Hegel is a great philosopher. But I think that characterization seriously misrepresents Erigena.
Well, thanks for the answer, John, and I look
Welcome.
forward to
Thank you.
seeing any further conclusions you have on this. So,
Well,
see ya.
thank you. Thank you for the great question. Like I said, I expect that the progress on that will, hopefully it'll be slow but steady. I'm hoping.
Good.
And speaking of dialogos, we've been trying to get the practice going again on the server. So we started trying to meet on Saturday, going through your practice that you presented to us with I think Guy and Chris. So we're playing around with that some more, and as well as going through on Sunday, going through Plato's The Symposium, and
Oh, well, that's excellent. That's excellent. Yeah, I mean, I'm still playing around with it too, and I'm still talking to other people who are playing around with it. You know, Guy's doing stuff where he's trying to integrate circling and elements of philosophical fellowship in. You know, Taylor Barrett has been running these variations, experimental variations, in with you know, with circling and authentic relating, and sort of shared problem solving within distributed cognition. Um, and you know, there's other people I need to talk to more. But yeah, it's something that I keep coming back to again and again and again, and trying to unpack it slowly and carefully, because there. I'm now convinced that there's I mean, there's a reason. There's a reason why there's a lot of sociocultural convergence on these communicative and communing practices, and also why there tends to be a significant proportion of them that take on this extra, you know, sense of ontological depth and spirituality and other inadequate words. But yeah, so trying to make this all hang together, it's both it's complex and it's fun, and but it's also something that I'm very privileged that there's a lot of other people that I have very good faith in are working on it as well. So there you go. I mean, you know, Dan Chiappa and I were getting some papers published on, you know, the scientists using the rovers on Mars, and the idea that hyper objects are ultimately only cognitively graspable by distributed cognition. And Jordan Hall and I are going to do a series of discussions on hyper objects and what that means for meaning making. So, yeah, taking this Yeah, it's very much the core of what I'm doing outside of my sort of strict scientific work right now.
That's awesome. Mark, you have a question for John.
Mark,
Hey, John, you sound really well. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good. I mean, my year's been really good. I'm tired. Been really busy. How have you been? I haven't talked to you in a while.
I've been doing okay. I'm on vacation up on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. I drove up here from South Carolina, and yeah, it's been a fun trip. Although the weather's miserable, so
Well, hopefully a break for you soon.
yeah, tomorrow looks like it's going to be good. I'll still be here with my jacuzzi, looking out over the ocean. So it should be a fun trip. I'm glad that we're back to Massachusetts is back to normal. They just got rid of mask mandates, so I was able to eat lunch without putting on a mask to walk to a table to take a mask off, which was refreshing. So
Canada has turned around things here. We were behind the United States for a long time on the vaccine rollout.
yeah.
We're now doing better, and so it looks like by the end of July, everybody's going to have had both doses, and we'll be on top of things. So looking forward to this summer.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's good to hear. That's exciting. It's nice when things are open back. South Carolina wasn't really closed for very long, so I just wasn't used to every time I travel up here to see family, having to do masks everywhere, and so it's sort of catch as catch can. So it's not a Greek question, we'll say. I'm sort of curious because I've been thinking a lot about the difference between the Eastern spiritual traditions and sort of the Western spiritual traditions. That's how I like to sort of couch it. And I know you talk a lot about narrative, and you sort of seem to jump in and out of the role of narrative in all of this. So I was wondering if you could riff on your ideas, because I have my own, but I don't want to state it. I'm still working through my stuff as well.
Sure.
On the difference between the narrative tradition in the East and the narrative tradition in the West. We'll say, aside from the obvious, well, hopefully obvious, I shouldn't assume it's obvious, way that stories are constructed in a circular fashion in the East due to the cultural, the whole idea of the Tao, et cetera, versus in the West where stories are more goal-oriented. But sort of past that, do you see differences in the narrative traditions or the purpose of narratives or the construction of narratives, et cetera, between East and West? Because that would really interest me to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, what you said is a major difference, because there isn't quite the same thing as in the West, what you'd call a historical narrative. The mixture of, I mean, maybe that's also true of the West, but we just don't see it. But there's more of a mixture of myth and history, like you get in Herodotus, as opposed to what you get into like Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War. So there's that difference. But you said you wanted to put that aside. It seems to be more of a reflection on the connection between the ego, for lack of a better term, and narrative in the East that I don't see quite as explicitly developed. I mean, there are, of course, exceptions. There's some exceptions in the mystics within the Neoplatonic tradition. Eckhart and Dionysius come to mind. But generally, because of the Aristotelian influence, there's a certain transparency about the connection between narrative and ego in the West, whereas in the East, there seems to be more opacity to it. There's a stepping back and reflecting on it. And you can see this especially like if you take a look at the Kyoto school and its reflection on Jung. Jung, of course, has a very narrative model of the self, Gnostic narrative, in fact, I would argue. And you see a lot of challenge of that from people like Maso Abi and others, precisely because they feel that, well, they argue, I shouldn't say they feel, I shouldn't make them sound like romantics. They argue that narrative structure is insufficient for getting to the ground of the psyche and to the ground of reality. And so typically it's that kind of argument against the West from East. I mean, I have to be careful. I mean, you're putting me in a difficult position. I don't claim to be sort of a master of all Eastern philosophy or anything like that. So I'm largely relying on what I know of from the Tao Te Ching and other Taoist texts, what I know from Buddhism, but especially what's influencing me most right now, because I can see them in comparison and contention, is the work of the Kyoto School. Like I said, especially the more recent members like Maso Abe, because they are recent enough that they can critically reflect on both Tillich and Jung, and so they tend to find the narrative within Jung's Gnostic ecology and the narrative within Tillich's Protestant theology as, while containing very important insights, there's a lot of respect, nevertheless as insufficient.
What's the sense of the insufficiency that you're pointing out there?
So the insufficiency is that the thing about the narrative structuring of the psyche is it doesn't get at what it is that generates the narrative, what it is about reality that makes narrative possible, what's the explanation between narrative aspects of the psyche and narrative aspects of reality and non-narrative aspects. And so the Eastern thinkers generally think you have to go deeper, you have to go into this is why they tend to prefer things like Heidegger. You have to go deeper. You have to go into fundamental ontology, principles around Dasein, etc. So they tend to find the bridging level is at more fundamental phenomenological ontology, like Heidegger, rather than at the narrative level. I think that at times, because of that, they're unfair to Tillich, because I don't think they get how, yes, I get that Tillich is still within the Gnostic sort of structure. He talks about the God beyond the God of theism, which I think is also a useful idea, very useful idea. But I think they fail to appreciate at times Tillich's discussion about the ground of being and how deeply influenced he was by Heidegger. That of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, so it's not, what you're saying is the Western is not self-critical enough to deal with, we'll call it maybe the psychological aspect of narrative, whereas the East wants to go deeper and get past that psychological aspect or something. Is that roughly what you're on about?
Yeah, so Jung is often accused of sort of psychologism, of rendering everything as a psychological category, and that this is considered ontologically inadequate. Yeah, generally that's what I get from the Kyoto School. Interesting.
Okay. Yeah, that is interesting. And then just quickly as a follow-up, so I'm not sure. I like you, I'm certainly not an expert in Eastern anything. Although I have a lot of friends from those countries out there in Asia. And the difference in thought, the difference between the Eastern thought and Western thought, as a general rule, is fascinating to me. Do you get a sense for the role of narrative with, we'll say, the average person rather than the general spiritualists or psychologists or philosophers, in terms of the difference? Is there a difference in kind between Eastern and Western interaction with literature or something?
Yeah, there's a difference, and this has been shown more in the work of Nisbet and others who do cross-cultural psychology. And of course, now it comes into question of whether or not this is a difference of degree or a difference of kind. So let's do it in terms of like even visual art. So of course, we have to acknowledge this is about entire populations. Of course, there's individual variations within both populations, but on average, people in the West, for example, want a subject in the center of a picture, and then everything behind it is background and is focused on the subject. And that seems to fit with their sort of structures of how they see narratives unfolding. The Asiatic perspective tends to emphasize empty space and typically is therefore not individualistic. It's more collective. It is willing to emphasize empty space. It often what we would consider background is foregrounded, and the people or entities in it that are acting are actually just the context against which the emptiness is seen, and that can have an effect on literature, theater. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that there hasn't been, of course, a long period of interaction, and so you can find hybrid genres like aspects of manga and others where you get weird shifting between a more Western narrative structure and then a more Eastern narrative structure, and then you get these, like, especially Westerners, when they're watching some of this stuff, you can even catch it in anime. They'll get sort of weird, sort of what the heck is going on in this part of the story because of those flips. Because there are, of course, as you would expect, with increasing globalization and the long-term, international presence of Japan and China, there are, of course, huge swaths of hybrid genres. So it's hard to answer your question in sort of a simple category. But I've tried to give you sort of what the cross-cultural psychology points out. But like I say, you have to remember that there's huge individual differences within both of those groups, and also that there is the growing emergence of hybrid genres that mix the two together.
Yeah, no, that's yeah. We're trying to talk in large generalities and with large population sets, and so the variance is very high, and we tend to discount variance lately in our thinking for some reason. I don't know when that quite began. I think Taleb kind of points out some of the flaws in using averages for everything in Gaussian curve where they're not appropriate. That's sort of bent our thinking, but
so.
And
that leads a lot of misplaced debate. So to use a prototypical example, other people have commented on this. There's a lot of discussion about differences between how male and female cognition works. That's because there are reliable, measurable differences on average, but it's about 5%. What is ignored in this debate is the reliable overlap of 95% of the two graphs,
right?
Which should be what we should pay more attention to. So stuff like that.
Yeah, well, in our general reductionism to false dichotomy and false equivalency, it's kind of simultaneously when we talk about things, it makes it difficult to talk about large sets because we're resorting to average and throwing out anything that doesn't fit. We'll say either the average or the idea that the average is not a representative set of the extremes or something. And that's very poisonous to our thinking, and I think it's something that's much more prone in the West than in the East, for maybe because the East points out these extremes as a way of saying stay in the middle, whereas the West points to goals as a way of navigation, and that's just different modes of thought or something. Limited extent that I've read any of the Eastern literature that pointing out of extremes rather than focusing on, we'll say, hero's journey or goal-like stuff.
The interesting thing about that critique of the West, which I don't think is misplaced, is, of course, it's only since modernity. If you look at the Greeks, everything in moderation, Aristotle's golden mean, there was a deep understanding of the avoidance of extremes as being central to making sense of life and of reality. But I agree with you. Somewhere along the line, have lost that, and it has become bound up with adversarial processing as the main way in which we try and do discourse. That's why the project you folks are engaging in of trying to bring in communing and dialogos is really, you should take how seriously countercultural that is and why it's valuable.
I think, John, actually the biggest breakthrough for me that you brought into meditation in general, and I, for some reason, I seem to be able to meditate just fine without this, but the communitas is really important because it gives you the multiple perspectives. And I actually started a YouTube channel recently called Navigating Patterns, and I'm going through the flowcharts now. I actually have the third video recorded in that particular set, where I'm going through the model patterns and the need for perspective. And yeah, I mean, the East is very adversarial in a positive fashion by pointing out the extremes, whereas the West has reduced everything to a single center point called the average, which is a bad mathematical way of understanding the world. And then that's created the false dichotomy and false equivalency problem. And we can't find extremes anymore. And so we don't believe they exist, and we swing wildly between them. So, yeah, I think that's sort of, we reduced the Greek sense, right? The Greeks had it right, but we didn't. So we're not listening to them anymore, and we've strayed from the path, if you will.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Yeah, thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.
All right. Alex Dinora has a question that he'd like me to read. Would it be fair to say that the experience of volition is internal, as opposed to something that we infer from the environment? Intuitively, it seems that some internal knowledge or information of capacities for action are necessary for affordances to arise, which suggests to me that acting must feel like something even before we can observe its external consequences. Furthermore, experiences like paralysis seem difficult to explain without something like an internal sense of volition that is failing to be carried out in the world.
So, I mean, it depends what you mean by volition. And I'm glad the term volition was used rather than will, because that does give us flexibility. So one way that I think you can think of volition is, using the Friston's predictive processing model, which I'm trying to integrate with Brett Anderson and Mark Miller with relevance realization. I think we're having a lot of success on it, especially the great work being done by Brett. One way you can think of volition is the match between top-down prediction, which is what imagination largely is, and bottom-up detection, and the generation of error signal. And I think, notice the caution in my language, because this is all of this stuff is just, like, Preston only started talking about this, 10, 15 years ago. So this is all stuff we have to, I mean, it's exciting and cutting edge, and it's growing in, the convergent evidence for it's growing in plausibility, but nevertheless, we should take care. But you can think of there being some sense, and this goes into precision weighting and things like explaining the fluency effect, but there's some sense of when there is a tight match between the top-down prediction and the bottom-up detection. And so the error that has to be processed, the mismatch error, and the rate of the mismatch error is sort of going down in a reliable fashion. And I think that's our sense of volition, because what you're measuring when you're measuring that is how well the sensory motor loop is looping. And I take it that that's what volition is pointing to. And I agree with you, there has to be some inner measure of when the top-down prediction and the bottom-up detection are matching, and error is being maintained or even perhaps progressively reduced. And you can think of the opposite when there is a significant mismatch between that. It's precisely when we start to get a sense of losing agency, and then it depends how far up the chain that goes. I mean, if the prediction is right at the sort of sensory level, we think we've acted, but we've acted clumsily. If that error travels higher and higher up within the cognitive machinery, what you tend to get is people experiencing things like a loss of agency, depersonalization, derealization. At least this is what people are theorizing right now. So I do think there is a way talking about volition as the sense of that match and its fluency. And I think that is very valuable, because it's much more like Spinoza's sense of conatus than it is, the medieval idea of freedom of the will. So I do think it's plausible that there is an inner sense and it has a phenomenological aspect to it. That's what I think probably right now the most plausible hypothesis of what that inner sense is tracking. And it's also, as I've mentioned, it's relative to the level at which the error signal is propagating. If the propagation doesn't go very high up, when there's a high error mismatch, the problem's sort of in the world. We've been clumsy. We've knocked over something. Right? But as it progresses higher up within the cognitive processing, I think we start to get, and we have metaphors around this. We're starting to lose a grip on things where we're talking about our sanity as opposed just to whether or not we're graceful in our movements. I hope that was a helpful answer.
Thank you. Richard, you have a question for John. Well, if you're trying to talk, we can't hear you yet. Make sure you're unmuted. Oh, we're still not getting you, Richard. I'm sorry. I know you were trying to write out your question. If you write it out, I'd be happy to read it. We'll give it one more shot. Okay, I'm gonna read it for you, Richard. If you get in there in the middle, just start talking. Hello, John. It's good to be here. I got this from Peterson through Paul, but I've been unable to dive into AftMC and the server until now. So again, I'm grateful to be here. One of the most striking ideas that I've been able to comprehend in AftMC, one that has been practically impactful for me, is the danger of relying on deprivation to achieve enlightenment, as well as the idea of modal confusion. I saw this strongly in my own life, especially in my struggle with sexual discipline. I do this within a Christian context as an adherent to that religion. I get the sense that I should be pursuing higher modes of being instead of aiming for deprivation. But of course, these things can easily be seen in having mode. Things in my tradition, which I think about doing, because they are higher, like service, teaching, contemplation, and meditation, cultivating wisdom, etc., can fall prey to this. How do you avoid viewing these practices in the having mode? And ultimately, when do I know I am successful in the being mode? And how do I maintain that?
That, Richard, is a really good question. It's one that I return to again and again and again, trying to improve a response to that question. So Chung-Pa wrote on this quite a while ago. It's considered a classic, although there's a bit of irony because he sort of fell prey to the very thing he was criticizing, called spiritual materialism. One way of understanding that is the idea of pursuing spiritual practices, like you said, from the having mode. And this is often seen in people who want to gather wonderful experiences and unique experiences that they can sort of treasure and show and talk about to their friends to prove often a narcissistic point. This has now been taken up into a more clinical discussion about the dangers of spiritual bypassing, which is people using spirituality as a way of avoiding dealing with significant issues of self-deception, issues of unresolved trauma, etc. And there's people now studying this. And I think those two phenomena are quite related and probably different aspects of the same overall phenomena. So the danger you point to, I think, is a real danger. For me, I've sort of tried to advocate two, and forgive me for this, but I think it's right, two dialogical ways of seeing if you're in the being mode. And I think this is actually well argued for within the Christian tradition, especially in the words of St. Paul and the idea of the body of Christ as a way of talking about this. Of course, he's using his particular ontology and his particular metaphors. And also the idea, that Paul picks up on from Jesus of, where two or three are gathered in my name, I'm there in the midst of them. And like I said, this seems to be also something that all the authentic relating, communing, discourse movements are intuitively trying to zero in on. Finally, just to put one more important line of convergence, there's an increasing cognitive science on the fact that we reason and problem solve much better in groups than we do as individuals. It doesn't mean that there are not biases that work at the group level. There are. But in general, distributed cognition does a better job than individual cognition, which flies in the face of the individualism that is so much beloved in the West. Now, why did I do all that? Because I propose to you that the way to know you're in the being mode is dialogically. So one of the things I've told people in Sangha, and I found this true in my own practice and talked about by other people, sort of exemplars from these wisdom traditions, is when other people notice a change in you that you yourself were not aware of, that's like a counterintuitive experiment that gets data, and therefore you take it very seriously. That's very good evidence that you are undergoing actual transformation rather than just narcissistic hoarding of wonderful experiences that prove that you are unique and the universe has always been set up to love you and such things. The other thing for me, you can see again, I think I could make a good case that you can see these kinds of tests at work, even in the epistles of St. Paul, is when you can go to an important, perennially recognized body of literature, wisdom source, and you are getting into a relationship of reciprocal opening. I'll use an example from my own life. So I read Plato. That informs and hopefully potentially transforms me. I go out and live that in the world, changes me and my interaction with the world, discloses parts of the world to me. And I come back with that change and I reread Plato and I see things in Plato I hadn't seen before. And that opens me up and opens the world up to me again. That cycle continues reliably, such that I come to a deeper and deeper appreciation of Plato, or perhaps of the Bible, or perhaps of the Tao Te Ching, etc. So that kind of sense of unfolding sacredness with respect to venerated texts, I think is important. Notice that's not the same thing as worshiping the text or saying it's beyond criticism or question. I never said that. And finally, I would say when those two are resonating with each other, with the way the traditional texts are opening up to you and the ways other people are opening up to you and noting that you have opened up, I think when all of those are aligning, that's the best kind of evidence we can have that we're following the being mode and undergoing genuine transformation and development, as opposed to misappropriating it within the having mode and just gathering narcissistic treasures of wonderful experiences. I hope that was helpful, Richard.
All right, thank you. So this will probably be the last question of the night. So Cliff, I just sent you an invitation.
Yes, thank you. Hello, Brett. Hello, John.
Cliff.
Hi.
Hey, thank you for letting me in. Just a quick question from me. I've been implementing some of these Neoplatonist practices we've been talking about in the last few discussions. And just real quick, I accidentally, what happened was, so my community has become, so as a result of this, now we're not all just Stoics now. Some of us have become have turned into Epicureans, and some of us have become Neoplatonists. And I'm like,
Right.
Previously this would have been seen as kind of a heresy, but that's not really very wise in general. Now, you see, John. So it's been very fruitful, our question and answer sessions. Now,
Great.
yeah, and I'm really thankful for that. Now, here's what I was thinking about, because I had a problem recently. Much love to you and the community. How should an individual which has direct access to several self-cultivation psychotechnologies and practices, that is capable of self-reflection, seeing through illusion, general wisdom as you describe it, ideally help people which are profoundly self-deluded, hostile, defensive, about an egoic, self-harming identity, attachment to social circles, or drugs, an ill-formed character as we understand it in the wisdom traditions. That's the first problem, because some of these people do approach with an interest to seek introspection, to see, get a grip on what it means to embody the being mode, right? Well, but when I get to these things, their reactions tend to be visceral, viscerally self-defensive. They're not open. They're not really open. You see, it's just like,
Yeah. This
yeah,
is a perennial problem.
yeah. And another thing, just on the side, something very similar to this. How identifying messages, which as a result of right character, you understand. How does this individual approach people who are severely lacking in wisdom, yet superior in social hierarchies, such as, job environments, or maybe familial hierarchies, or things that are almost outside of your control? How do you think? What is, if you can give me like a general overview of what would be ideal to do with these people? And if there's no time, then I'd appreciate some resources if you can think of any.
So I'll try and do both. Try and do both. Give at least a cursory gestural answer, and then point to some resources. So so Plato wrestled with this. This is the Alcibiades problem, first problem that you pointed to, and I've come to think that there's a deep answer there, which is the idea that trying to directly talk to people about that are coming from the place where you're talking about, trying to directly present philosophia to them, is largely going to have it's called in psychology reactance. That's what you're talking about. You called it a visceral counteractive response.
It's what killed Socrates ultimately.
Yeah, exactly. And so and that's in there to say that this problem isn't one for which there's any kind of surefire response, precisely because it got Socrates killed. Plato offers, and I think he follows Socrates on offering this, the idea that you, please take this metaphorically, it's a charged word today, but he offers what's called the seduction model, that you don't initially present people with this. You try to present them with practices that decenter them, but it's not presented that way. And what you're trying to do is get them interested in things that have beauty, have flow in them. They get drawn in by the beauty. the possibility of experiencing flow, things like that. And so the idea is you try to move them to a liminal place where they are already engaging in some of these practices, and then help coax them into realizing, in addition to sort of the beauty and the flow, there's other things that are happening that are already happening to them. Because people are less reactant if they're involved in something positive and they already notice the change happening. And then that takes me to the second thing. And Drew Hyland's book on Plato and the Question of Beauty is very important about this, which is, and it with some videos with Andrew Sweeney and Christopher Mastropietro, been arguing, that virtue is actually the beauty of wisdom, and this is also a Socratic idea.
Yeah.
And so I think with people, again, who are in your hierarchy, and again, remember what I'm saying, and remember what you said, they still killed Socrates. This is not a surefire method, right? But what you can do, right, is virtue is the beauty of wisdom, and that's a way, again, of drawing people not directly to wisdom, but drawing them into the liminal attractive space so that they might be drawn into the attractor and start opening up to the possibilities of wisdom.
Yeah. That's very good, John. Thank you very much. It's just, if I may add, you're not responsible for giving me like a reason to all of to deal, like a way to deal with all human evil. It's a stupid sort of proposition, right? But how do I explain it?
Maybe I can help you, because if it seems I'm conveying that, then I don't mean to. I see you as a community builder, and I'm trying to respond to you in that role. What I think would be helpful as a community builder, but I am cognizant also of our proclivity, and this sort of came up in my discussion with Mark, of bottom line thinking and thinking that there's algorithms for everything and for every outcome, and trying to reverse engineer everything, which is problematic. So that's where I'm coming from.
In my life, the thing is, I have a very extensive personal framework for approaching this practice of wisdom traditions. Like, I have been naturally building practices and shaping my mind directly, but the only reason I stick first and foremost with stuff like Buddhism and Stoicism is because this framework had to be something I inherited, had to be broken first, and then I had to pick up the pieces, you see. And that's why I teach Stoic and Buddhist practices first and foremost, aside from practicing them. Now, my question is...
Sorry, Cliff, I think you'll have to wait till next time for another question.
No problem.
But
No problem.
I want to respect John's
fine.
time here, and thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who asked questions tonight. That's amazing. We just love having you here. And before I thank John, I just wanted to remind people, in the spirit of community building, this community here, we're focused a lot on psychotechnologies and practices, and we have a lot of practices that we're trying to get going on the server here. And so if we've got like I mentioned before, Dialogos practice going. We're trying to get philosophical fellowship going. We have meditation every morning, a couple times a day. There's European time as well. We've got book clubs on studying, the wisdom of Hypatia, Plato's The Symposium. We're experimenting with rituals. There's a lot of stuff going on, so I encourage everyone to add our calendar to your Google calendars. You can find it in the announcements in the pinned post, or you can find it in the show notes to the YouTube video. And if you're still watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to this. And again, thank you, John, for being here. It's been fantastic.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone. And Cliff, I hope we get to talk next time. Okay, thank you, everyone, and thank you as always, Brett. I'm going to head out now. I'm already a little bit late. So take good care, everyone.
Thanks, John. Appreciate having you.
Bye.